What's up, pals? Pete and Bessie here for the Comics Pals. We're here at New York Comic Con with the legendary Mr. Gerry Conway. How's your New York Comic Con going so far, Gerry?
It's been great. I've met a lot of fans, met some old pro friends, and it's been terrific.
It's been a good time?
Yeah, I'm having a good time.
Awesome, glad to hear it. So, Gerry, since you've entered the industry as a teenager, you've been one of the most influential voices in comics for a long time. And I don't say that just to flatter you, but as you can see right here, you're responsible for some of the best-known characters out there. We've got like Punisher, Jason Todd, Man-Thing. So I wanted to ask, do you have like a favorite creation? Is there anybody who really holds a special place in your heart?
Well, both Punisher and Firestorm are two of my favorites for very different reasons. I mean, Punisher, I actually didn't write that very many stories of, but obviously he's had a terrific cultural impact, so that's been a pleasure for me as a creator. Firestorm, I worked with that character for about 10 years, so I had a lot of emotional commitment to him, and I really enjoy him as a character.
So actually, speaking of the Punisher, I wanted to ask, I know you created him as an antagonist for Spider-Man originally, so were you at all surprised to see how much he exploded in popularity as like a hero in his own right?
Well, we knew almost immediately after the first issue came out that featured him that fans had a positive reaction to him. He quickly became one of our most popular antagonists for Spider-Man, but there was also the sense that he had more depth and more appeal beyond just being an antagonist. He had a quality to him that readers were responding to, a pathos in his backstory that seemed to make him more of an anti-hero than a hero, but make him a character that you wanted to find out more about.
What do you think it is about Frank that people really connect with?
Well, I think it's his damaged soul. I mean, this is a guy who, like Spider-Man, is surmounting tragedy. His tragedy is very personal. It's his family, his loss of his family, and his response to it is very different than Peter Parker's. But they're both rooted in that sense of loss of control over the world and an attempt to regain control. And I think all of us can relate at some level to the idea that the world is out of our control, and we want to somehow create some impact.
Absolutely. So before we move off of Punisher, I see you over here. You have a picture of you and John Bernthal. So did you get a chance to see his portrayal of the character in Daredevil season 2?
I did. Yeah, obviously I loved it, and I managed to get invited to the set for the Punisher TV series, the Netflix series, and met John. I think they're doing, from what I've been able to see, a terrific job with the show.
That's great. So you've already gotten kind of a sense of maybe some of the episodes or what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, a general sense. I mean, I don't know any more than anybody else who's alert, but I did get to see the shooting of episode 2, so
That's awesome. So you're looking forward to it?
Very much.
Cool. So moving on to Spider-Man. So you were the first writer to take over Spider-Man after Stan Lee, which is obviously a really huge responsibility. But I think what makes that story so much more interesting was that you were only 19 years old when you did this. So I know you've talked about in the past about how it really kind of created a lot of anxiety for you. But can you just tell us a bit about that? What was it like to be taking over this like iconic character from the man who created him at 19?
Well, I mean, one of the great things about being a teenager is that you really don't know what you don't know. So I think my sense of my own capacity to take on that kind of responsibility was pretty inflated. So I while I was intimidated, I don't think I was as intimidated as I should have been. But as it turned out, I had an advantage in that being 19, 20 years old, I was writing a character who was very similar to me in his own life experiences. So that gave me an insight into Peter Parker's life that I think enabled me to write the character authentically, even though my level of experience may not have justified that assignment. Although, to be fair, at 19 I had also been writing in comics professionally for about 3-4 years. So I did have, sufficient professional experience to know what I was doing, just not perhaps enough life experience.
Yeah, maybe not for that level of marquee title, but I mean, you certainly did a great job. So I mean, proof's in the pudding. So I actually that reminds me of another thing I had read in a previous interview where you said that when you returned to Spider-Man in the late 80s, early 90s, that you felt that as a grown man that you had a better understanding of the character, despite the fact that you said being a teenager really did play into writing Spider-Man. So what did you feel that you had learned? What was the experience that you had gained that really felt, that made you feel you had a better understanding of Peter?
Well, I had a set of life experiences. I mean, Peter also at that point was further along in his life. You know, he was in his late 20s, I think. They were writing him as someone who is out in the professional world, living his life, and that was something I could relate to. But the other aspect was that when I was writing the book originally, I was writing it kind of from a seat of the pants, instinctive point of view. And when I came back to it in the late 80s, I was writing it from a more mature perspective. You know, I had sufficient life experience to understand the character in a way that I hadn't understood him, and I certainly understood some of the other supporting characters like Robbie Robertson and Jonah Jameson and even Mary Jane much more effectively at that point in my life.
So before we move on from Spider-Man, during your run on Amazing Spider-Man, I mean, you famously scripted the death of Gwen Stacy. We've got it right here, the man who killed Gwen Stacy. So, you know, you as a young creator who's taken over this book from the original writer, you know, you're already kind of like nervous about this. Were you at all like concerned about what the fan reaction was going to be or what people would think of you?
Stupidly, no. I mean, as I say, being a teenager, being a young adult, you don't have much perspective beyond your own experiences, and I was not at that time a fan favorite writer. I've never actually at the moment been a fan favorite writer. It's usually in retrospect that I get appreciation.
Underappreciated in your time?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say I was underappreciated because obviously the readers were buying the books and enjoying them, but when I was writing comics, there were other people who were stars, so I wasn't expecting any great approval, and but by the same token, I wasn't expecting any terrific disapproval. I think we were all taken aback by the strength of the reaction, and I think the strength of the reaction had more to do with the details and the manner of Gwen's death than the fact of her death. Previously, when characters died in superhero comic books, they died either heroically or tragically, and Gwen's death was almost it was postmodern, you know, in that she died needlessly, you know, and Peter Parker, Spider-Man's inability to save her wasn't even heroic. It was just sort of like
It's like a mistake.
yeah, it was a mistake. It was the hero trying to be a hero and failing, I think, was the shock.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anything else.
So that actually reminds me of something I wanted to ask, which is, so a lot of people look at the death of Gwen Stacy as kind of the end of the Silver Age of comic books and the beginning of what is commonly known as the Bronze Age. So when you were like penning that story, did you think that it was going to be a major moment, that it would like really have impact in the long term like that?
No. I was hoping to do a story that would excite and stimulate the readers, you know, and make them passionate about the book and express the passion I felt for the character and for the book. The idea that none of us in the early mid-'70s had any notion that comic books would even exist past about 1980. We were on a downward trend as a publishing enterprise. I mean, both Marvel and DC were hitting really depressed sales. And if the Superman movie had not come out in the late 70s, I think comics as a business probably would have evaporated by the 80s. So the idea that here we sit in a convention that has 150,000 people celebrating comics and the cultural impact of comics is very surreal.
That's something I'm certainly thankful for, because otherwise I would have missed out on it.
There There you go.
So you've said in the past that early on in your career, well, you said you had been writing comics since you were 16. You did a lot of horror anthology kind of stuff, and you said all you really wanted to do was write superheroes, but specifically Marvel superheroes. So I wanted to ask, what motivated you to jump ship to DC after you had gotten your dream job and were getting to write all these characters?
Well, there were a lot of personal issues that I had dealing with editorial changes at the company. And I think also I was getting restless. I'd been writing Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, Thor, all of these top characters for many years at that point. And, these days people write series for 5, 10, 15 years. But back then, that was a lot of work. That was a lot of material to go through. And I think that combined with some disappointments I was experiencing professionally at Marvel just made me feel it was time for a change.
So I actually wanted to ask, I read that, I thought it was really interesting that you were the editor-in-chief of Marvel for, you said about a month and a half. So can you there's got to be a story there. Can you tell me about that?
Well, I had gone over to DC. I was working as an editor-creator at DC on my own line of books, basically. And the editor who had replaced Roy Thomas, Len Wein, had hit a wall. He didn't want to keep doing the major editorial job that he'd been doing, and he made a deal with Stan to step aside and write and edit his own books. And Marv Wolfman had replaced him, and then Marv had decided he wanted to do the same thing. So Stan was casting about, looking for someone to take over as editor, and that was the job that I had really wanted to have. I thought I wanted to have. I came in into Marvel, and by that point, the company had changed culturally, and it wasn't the company that I had left, and we had some personality conflicts. I was not happy with the situation as I found it, and I really preferred the kind of system that I had been developed working at DC. So didn't work out. I stuck around for another 5 or 6 months while we tried to negotiate a different kind of arrangement for me, and eventually I just went back to DC.
Yeah, so during your time in DC, you obviously wrote a lot of books, but I would say you're probably most well known for your 8-year run on Justice League of America. So I kind of wanted to ask, after working in the Marvel camp for so long, after growing up with Marvel stuff and wanting to write for Marvel, what was it like to make that jump to DC and have to adjust to a new universe and a new tenor?
Well, I had been both a Marvel and DC fan. One of the first books that I fell in love with as a comic book reader was Justice League. So going back to DC was sort of like coming home. It was coming home to my first professional home, and it was coming home to the characters and the story styles that I had enjoyed when I was very young. So it wasn't that big a leap. Plus, DC was trying to embrace storytelling that was more in the form and style and depth of the Marvel method. So that was also more comfortable to me. It wasn't probably as dramatic a change as you might think.
So I guess it was kind of a natural transition with just the way that the culture was kind of going at that time. Okay, so just before we wrap up, I kind of wanted to ask, Gerry, what's next for you in comics? Do you have anything you're working on you want to talk about? Or?
Well, I just finished a run on Amazing Spider-Man Renew Your Vows, working with the great Ryan Stegman. And at the moment, I'm sort of judging my options and seeing where things are going to take me. I'm planning on writing a memoir because
Very exciting.
Yeah, my friend Len Wein just passed away, and it occurred to me that people of my age are starting to drop off. So while that particular tragedy hit home, it did make me say, well, maybe there are some stories I can pass on and be interesting to the next generation.
I honestly, yeah, I think you'd be doing us a great service, because I think whenever you do get the privilege to talk to somebody that lived through those days, like you said, a lot of you guys I don't think look at it the same way that we do, with that it is a big, important part of this history. And I think you'd be doing us a great service. So thank you so much for your time, Gerry. This was a great interview. If you guys want to check out the rest of the stuff we're doing here at New York Comic Con, we're going to be here on interviewing all kinds of creators. You can follow us on YouTube, like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and we'll see you guys for the next video. Take it easy. Thank you so much, Gerry.